We also need to be reminded that our behavior and how we interact with each other has to be consistent with getting to that finish line.
We'll need strength to get through this pandemic, and to find this strength, we need our families.
As I've said before, this is a team effort. It's a Team Ontario effort. We need every single person, every single household, and every single business doing their part.
I implore you, do the right thing. Get on the team. Manitoba's counting on you.
Just some of the provincial team reaction as provinces remain under increasing pressure to lock down their economies and to better handle the pandemic as cases of COVID-19 continue to climb there. But is one premier leading the pack, leading the country in terms of their response, in terms of political leadership? What do Canadians need to see more of from their premiers and from their representatives? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Althea Raj, and Andrew Coyne. Good to see everybody tonight. I know we've talked a lot about COVID, but it does seem this week again as though provinces and premiers have now in many ways sort of responded to what the Prime Minister did last week, which was say, hey, we need to do more here. Is there a province at this stage, let's take the Atlantic part out of it because they're sort of in a world of their own, happily. Is there a province who is leading better than others? And I'll start with you, Althea.
Well, leading better is a hard thing to say because, frankly, what measure do you use? Do you use the number of COVID cases? Do you use their communication style? There are clearly premiers that are doing less well than others. I think specifically of Jason Kenney in Alberta, for example. The polling numbers suggest that people in that province believe the premier is not doing a great job either. But I don't know that now is really the right time to say who's doing best and who's doing worst. I think we can talk about the different styles of the premiers. It struck me today hearing Premier Legault that he's pleading with people to please follow the rules. And Doug Ford is more like, hey, I'm going to come down tough if you don't do this. So you kind of see people's personalities a little bit, but I can't honestly say that one premier is doing a far better job than the others because they're really facing different circumstances.
Yeah, I wonder too, though, Chantal, whether provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta that were not hit in the same way in the first wave are struggling because the second wave is actually much worse for them. And so it becomes difficult for premiers to know how to respond given that they weren't given the same opportunity as Ontario and Quebec in the first time around.
Oh, you mean having a trial by fatality,
exactly,
as Ontario and Quebec had last fall? Possibly, but that is also on people who live in those provinces. The fact that the first wave spared some provinces more than they did other, it certainly instilled a sense of false security. But I'm with Althea on this. I don't think this is a great time to pick premiers, as in someone deserves a prize, because I believe they're all trying very hard to find the right balance. And the right balance is not only counted in cases, it's counted in your capacity to keep having the confidence of enough people so that whatever you need to do in January, February going forward will still have some impact on your audience. On that basis, for sure, Alberta stands out for a majority saying they disapprove of Jason Kenney's proposal, but management of the crisis. But at the end of the day, they're all in a tough place. Christmas is coming. It's a nightmare. And they're all going to try to get over it as best they can, but there is no playbook for this.
No. Maybe you've both made the best point, though, and that is that it is really not about judging how they're managing it from a public health perspective, but whether their citizens are happy with them. And the other thing that public opinion polls seem to be showing, Andrew, is that Canadians' anxiety is growing again, much as it did during the spring. So I guess then the question is, what do Canadians look to their leaders for in moments like that?
They look for clarity, for one thing, and they're not getting a lot of it. I think there was, in the initial stages, a rally around the flag effect. Most of the premier's approval ratings went up at that time, and they've been kind of burning that off ever since. people are becoming more and more pessimistic. If you looked at the polls in June, there was large numbers of people who had thought that the worst was behind us. That's a much smaller proportion saying that now. Everybody's approval ratings have come down over time because people are tired of this. They're frustrated that we haven't made better progress. They thought that we were starting to get out of the woods in July or August, and that has been, those hopes have been cruelly dashed. I think when you look at individual premiers, it's partly measured against expectations. I think Manitoba's Premier Brian Pallister, for example, is suffering because, no doubt because of some mishandling of the case, some complacency. But Manitoba, for a while there, looked like it was going to have very low caseloads, and it's now exploded into the worst per capita numbers in the country. So that, when you're measuring against prior expectations, that's going to hurt you. I think in Jason Kenney's case, who's also doing very poorly in the polls, it's partly because the messaging that was put out by the Premier and his people was something to the effect of they didn't say it in so many words, but they were going to be kind of the Sweden of Canada. They were going to take a less harsh, less restrictive approach. Well, it hasn't worked for Sweden, and it certainly hasn't worked for Alberta either. So he may be getting knocked down for people feeling that he hadn't taken the whole thing as seriously as he might have. Although I think you have to look at also the economic situation in Alberta, which was terrible even going into this. And that's always going to hurt anybody who's in power.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me just also flag these new modeling numbers that we're going to hear tomorrow that we've reported on already tonight, that there could be 60,000 cases a day by year's end if people don't change, like if there's no change in behavior. And those are just projections, obviously, but that puts more pressure too on premiers to clamp down. And I would assume that's in part what the Prime Minister would want as a result of those modeling numbers. I think, Chantal, you want to go in, and then Althea.
I just want to be specific on the 60,000 number. It's not if behavior doesn't change, it's if we increase our contacts, as most people might be tempted to do over the Christmas break. The numbers, if we keep on doing what we're doing, are staggering enough, 20,000. And that is why Christmas is a nightmare. You can clamp down, but you're not going to go into every house to see if people are not having private gatherings. And the experience of the fall has been that the more you clamp down on public gatherings, the more you are courting private gatherings. You said the anguish of Canadians is rising. Well, that's probably good news from a government's perspective, because if people are scared, they're more likely to do what they need to do, which is limit their contacts, than if they're feeling confident. And that goes back to why some provinces that did not have a bad first wave may be struggling more in the second wave. Well, because people possibly were not scared as much as the people who went through the first wave in a bad way.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. You're quite right. It's if we all go and have a great Christmas with our family members that things will get much worse. Althea.
I think the government is actually worried, and the governments across the country are worried that people are not scared enough. I think what we are actually seeing this week, and what we're going to see tomorrow with these numbers, and what we saw today with the Prime Minister bringing in the opposition leaders in for a briefing with Dr. Chang, is to get the message across to everybody that we do not have a control over this virus. Things are going to get a lot worse, and people really need to change their behavior. And we kind of got an indication of that earlier in the week when Dr. Howard New, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, said they didn't account for COVID fatigue in their modeling, and they didn't realize that people, the weather's getting cold and you're not meeting your friends outside in the park, and you're tired of staying home and getting your groceries delivered. You're really looking forward to going out and getting your own bread, chicken, whatever. And I think that people need to be. My sense is the politicians feel like the people need to be scared, and they're not scared enough at the moment.
The last word to you, Andrew.
I think, unfortunately, some of our leaders have contributed to that fear. We were in the spring, there were cases of absurdly restrictive policies where people were being prosecuted for playing soccer by themselves in the park. Lately, we've been having, it seems to me, incomprehensibly lax measures where we're still allowing gatherings of, depending on the province, of 25 people. That seems to me to be remarkably improvident. It's extraordinary to me that BC, for example, is only now getting around to making masks mandatory. We're having tough debates about when and whether to close schools, which ought to be kept open to agree that it's physically possible. But meanwhile, we're still leaving bars open. We're still, in some cases, allowing indoor dining. There's been a lot of randomness and no rhyme or reason to where we're clamping down and why. And I think some clarity and some reasonableness in the rules would help a long way towards assuaging people's fears.
Climate change remains one of the greatest challenges of our times. Just like with COVID-19, ignoring the risks of climate change isn't an option. That approach would only make the costs higher and the long-term consequences worse.
That is the Prime Minister from Thursday announcing plans and targets to try and reach the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is something the government campaigned on and now hopes to deliver on. This is sort of an accountability piece around climate change as opposed to the actual plan on how to get there, which the Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, says will come in the weeks ahead. But it raises some interesting questions on the same week that Quebec also announced plans, very aggressive plans on climate change, about whether climate change and a pandemic can help happen at the same time. And Chantal, I know you've written about this in the past and thought about it in the past, so I want to get your thoughts first on whether the timing here makes sense, whether it is important to maybe signal to markets and to the economy that when we come back, this is the way we're going to do things.
I think the markets and the economy have been signaling that when we come back, this is what we are going to have to do. I also think that if I were to take away one thing from this week, it is the signal, a clearer signal, that despite the pandemic, it will not be used as an excuse to push climate change off government's radar.
Right.
I take that cue not so much from the federal announcement, which targets are nice, but we've missed every single one of them for more than 20 years, but from the Quebec announcement, because this is a government that was not predisposed to the environment, that is in the middle of a pandemic, and that this week, for all the flaws of its plans, and it does not go the entire way, send a signal that it is going to be working on the climate change issue and not use the pandemic as an excuse to say we can't afford to do this, there's too much going on. I find that, from the climate change perspective, a clear signal.
Although the criticism also has happened the other way, that the governments are using the pandemic to push an agenda on climate change that they shouldn't bother pushing right now. I mean, that's obviously the Conservatives saying that kind of thing, Althea. So I'll get you to weigh in on that part, maybe.
I don't think that's accurate. I mean, this is something that the Liberals campaigned on in 2015 and really recommitted to in a big way in 2019.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with the pandemic. I think that you can talk about, getting involved in long-term care, in expanding the social safety net as things that the pandemic has brought to the agenda of government. Or maybe presenting a more expansive pharmacare program than what was originally intended, but not on the environment. And frankly, I'm with Chantal on the federal action this week is really kind of lack of action. This is about politics. It's not at all about policy. There is no plan to get to net zero by 2050. The Liberal government is not tied to any of the accountability measures. If you listen to the Prime Minister on Thursday talk, he's trying to make this a wedge issue between the Conservatives and the Liberals. We are committed to the environment. We're going to have targets, and you're going to have a plan for targets. And see over there, the big bad Conservatives, they don't have a plan for the environment, and they don't want targets, and they don't want to be bound by targets. Like, that was all what Thursday's announcement was about. It wasn't about policy.
But that's pretty interesting, though, and you're right to point it out, Althea, Andrew, because that sort of gets you thinking about where we're headed, not in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of politics and what the long game might be.
Yeah, I mean, they're very interested in binding some government 10 years from now. I mean, this is beyond performative. They'd be sending much more clear signals if they had serious policies directed to getting us to the targets. But as was mentioned, not only have we missed every target that we've set in the past, we're nowhere near the target that we're supposed to be aiming for in 2030. We're going to miss it by a mile. And as I say, they're now bringing in these quote unquote legally binding targets that don't kick in until 2030 and aren't actually binding even then. So it is purely performative. It is deeply unserious. We will see what comes in terms of actual policies. But, you know, the one thing that the pandemic did set up as an opportunity in this, and I'm usually loath to allowing governments the leeway to sort of piggyback on the pandemic, but it did bring oil prices way, way down. Mm-hmm. So there was an opportunity there to bring up the carbon price and accelerate the increase in the carbon price and have less impact on people's pocketbooks and less impact on their polling data. And we haven't seen any evidence yet that they're likely to try to increase the carbon price from what it was previously scheduled to do.
The
Can I just add something?
Yeah, go ahead, Althea.
Oh, sorry.
Of course. No,
just
go ahead.
On the idea that we're not going to meet the 2030 targets. I'm obviously not a climate scientist, but what I've been told by people who know this stuff is that, yes, we're on the road to miss them, but it's not impossible to miss them. But the government has yet to present a plan and to say how much it is going to cost us to meet those targets. Right. And that's really what you would expect the government to be laying out, and that is not what we have seen.
Well, it's a little curious to lay out an accountability act where you know, you might say this is what the government should be doing, but there's no consequence if you don't do it, before actually showing us how they plan to do all the things that we're talking about. It seems a little backwards to me, just in terms of rollout. So maybe it's just, as everyone said, politics and performative. Chantal.
I'm willing to wait to see if more comes down the pipeline. It seems to me that the Liberals are more interested in fighting the next election on we are good on the environment and the Conservatives are not. That could play a trick on them if the Conservatives find a way to bring themselves back in the tent. But that is why I believe the Quebec announcement was more important than the federal announcement, sure. Because up to a point, identified with Conservative government has decided that it needs to have more measures on climate change rather than say we're going to be focusing on the economy. I run the speech. And maybe Althea is right that the Liberals want to keep this as a wedge issue. If that's the case, that's a terrible thing, because what you need in this country is to recraft the consensus on climate change and not continue to try to win campaigns on perceptions. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt for now.
That's true, and I would agree with you. I think climate change is something we should all just agree that we're going to get to work on. But when you have a Conservative Party that doesn't seem to want to take that seriously, how do you build that consensus?
But what if
we don't know that yet.
Actions, we don't know that yet. We don't know that yet. Chantal, Althea, then Andrew. Yeah.
But what if Premier Legault's actions inspire Premier Ford to also become more proactive on climate change? And then what happens when Premier Ford makes that move is the federal Conservative Party has to somehow follow suit.
Yeah, that's a lot of ifs to get there, though. But Althea, the last word to Andrew. Yeah.
I was going to say, like, one of the biggest wedge issues in the Conservative leadership race was when Peter MacKay attacked Aaron O'Toole for suggesting that he was willing to put a price on carbon. And lo and behold, it was like, oh, no, Aaron O'Toole is in favor of a carbon tax. And Aaron O'Toole was out there saying, hey, wait, no, I'm just doing what over in Alberta, Jason Kenney is doing. Yeah. And the Conservative leader has spoken about how he wants to include not a price on carbon, but he wants to include a legitimate climate plan. He knows that people, especially in suburban areas, are concerned about climate, and he knows that he needs to do that, and he's working on that. He even said that in his speech to the Canada Club. So I mean, there is work being done in the leaders of the official opposition's office, but we don't yet know what that looks like.
Andrew, last word to you on this.
Nobody is terribly serious about climate change. If we were serious, we would be enacting policies that get the most bang for the buck, because we need to make yards against climate change, but we need to do so in a way that has the least impact on the economy. The policy that gets by far the most bang for the buck is carbon pricing, but not even the Liberals are relying on carbon pricing for more than a fraction of the total gains that they want to make. Mm-hmm. They also want to bring in a whole bunch of other much more costly programs, but programs where the costs are hidden from the public. So everyone's playing politics with this, enacting policies that are more costly than need be so that they can hide the costs from the public. And the reason they do that is ultimately the public's not serious about it. The public tells the pollsters, they talk a good game. They say, I want something done about climate change, but they don't want to pay for it themselves.
Okay, smart conversation and lots more on that topic to come. Thank you all, appreciate it.